Good afternoon. My name is Mark Johnson. I'm the editorial board chair for the CDO magazine, and I'm excited for today's conversation, which will focus on the evolving role of the chief data officer and the importance of education in preparing the data executive of the future. Joining me for this discussion is Dr. David Steier, professor at Carnegie Mellon University and lead faculty of the new Chief Data Officer Certificate Program, and Dr. Inderpal Bhandari, the Global Chief Data Officer of IBM, the advisory board chairman for the program, and a strategic advisor for CMU's new program. Dr. Steier and Dr. Bhandari, you're both alums from Carnegie Mellon, receiving your PhDs, and both have gone on to have distinguished careers in the field of enterprise data management and data science. Would you please talk about your individual career journey over the years? Let's get started with you, Dr. Steier.
Okay, thanks, Mark, and thanks for having me. I'm really happy to be here. It's interesting. Inderpal and I actually graduated from CMU at about the same time. I stuck around at CMU a little bit, was on the research faculty, working on software integration and various applications to engineering design. Then the field of consulting called me, and PricewaterhouseCoopers hired me for about a dozen years, Deloitte for about 8 years, and I've worked at a few startups as well, dealing a lot with unstructured data, which is relevant to today's conversation. My advice, by the way, to anybody listening to this is, since I left PwC and came back to PwC, I left CMU and came back to CMU, is don't burn any bridges, because you never know when you're going to need those connections again.
That's great advice. I can attest to that myself. Dr. Bhandari, how about you?
Well, yeah, we graduated about the same time. And I went on to IBM Research as a research staff member at that IBM Watson Research Center. So I was there for about 7 years. Mm-hmm. Then I started my own company in data mining and ran that for about 10 years. That then allowed me to get a good view of corporate America and the needs with regard to data. So I ended up creating this role of Chief Data Officer, the first in healthcare in 2006. Mm-hmm. There were only 4 of us globally at that time. Then the profession took off and took me with it. So I ended up creating that organizational capability, the Chief Data Office, in 4 organizations, IBM being the latest. And I second David's point that don't burn any bridges. I came back to IBM after almost 2 decades.
Wow, that's pretty amazing. Dr. Bhandari, since the Chief Data Officer role appeared on the enterprise landscape about 2 decades ago, the roles continue to evolve. In your opinion, how has the role evolved over the years?
Here's how I like to explain it. The data role has been around for a while, but the actual CXO labels, whether it's a Chief Data Officer or Chief Analytics Officer, Chief Digital Officer, Chief Transformation Officer, those are somewhat more recent. Mm-hmm. And I think the transformation that happened is there was a recognition and an awareness that this data role is a lot more strategic than it was previously understood to be, right? Previously, it was about, okay, manage my data, do some governance. That was the data role. And a lot of people tell me that when I tell my story about the role, being there were only 4 of us in 2006, and they'll say, yeah, but we were doing data stuff before that. But what actually happened was there was an awareness by the CEO, the C-suite, that data is actually a strategic asset for the company. Mm-hmm. And it can completely change and transform the company. And I think that was the key evolution in the role, which then brought it from being a department in the IT area into the C-suite, essentially. So that was the key transition and the key evolution of the data role.
Yeah, that's really a good point. I've seen that happen and been a participant there. Dr. Steier, in recent years, data sources are becoming more diverse, both in terms of including structured and unstructured data, and bringing external data content to complement internal data and streaming data from, IoT devices, et cetera. So just a very diverse landscape. How do you see the CDO's duties evolving in response to this rapidly diversifying and intensifying in velocity and volume data landscape?
Yeah, it's a really good question because structured and unstructured data, the distinction and how to deal with it has really been characterizing a lot of my career. I like to tell people that I like to focus on data that everybody else has given up on, and unstructured data is kind of an example of that. The data is stored on some raw format, and the traditional relational operations like selects and joins, they don't work. It's not in a traditional relational database. So that means that CDOs, they need to get comfortable with a situation in which it's impossible to even apply and measure data quality as it's traditionally defined. So invalid values, outliers, all of that is well defined for structured data, but not for unstructured data because you don't know how you're going to use the data. And sometimes directionally correct answers are the best you can get. You can't insist on absolute accuracy. So the CDO has to get comfortable with that. With external data, of course, the organization doesn't own the data, so the traditional notion of data governance has to get more flexible. You can't enforce your own organization's internal standards on external data, since you don't own it, and you have to anticipate changing fields, changing data structures. And so responsibilities include things like monitoring those external data sources, their changes for both challenges and opportunities, and ultimately developing, well, maybe not the CDO personally, but leading teams that develop connectors with new kinds of underlying technology, more like entity recognition, summarization, indexing, and translation than traditional SQL. So that definitely puts the CDO in a new environment.
Yeah, absolutely. And within that, I'd like to stay with you for a minute. Within that context, I think there is this notion of accelerating the value recovery or the value delivery from this diverse data landscape, which is really sort of on the consumption side of the data management and analytics, equation. How do you see the CDO influencing the consumption side and the value extraction?
Well, the CDO really then has to become an advocate, perhaps an evangelist, if you like that word, for using data in new ways, in strategic ways, and making sure that once data has been acquired, that it actually gets used, or perhaps if it doesn't get used, to keep a tab on the investment that the organization is making in that data. It definitely involves paying attention to the monetary value, both on the revenue possibilities and the cost side. Some people believe that, memory is free, just store all the data. I don't believe that. By the time you get to regulatory retention requirements, auditing requirements, traceability, and all that, it's definitely not free. So that becomes part of the CDO's responsibility as well.
Before we go on, Dr. Bhandari, how would you comment on that question of value extraction in this new diverse landscape and the role of the CDO to see that fulfilled?
Yeah, I mean, just in keeping with my remarks earlier, right? So the CDO's role is to make data a strategic asset. So what do you mean by that? What do you mean by that is there's a business strategy. The reason the CDO is a C-suite role is the CEO, senior executives, they have some kind of business strategy. They're planning to make money in some way. They're planning to accrete in value in some way. You've got to figure out what they're planning to do to be accretive in value. And you've got to figure out how to use data to get to that. So that's the value piece of the puzzle. That's how you end up creating value, by tying into the business strategy. Then, I mean, in terms of these, you've got to watch what's happening on the technology side. And David was just giving you an exposition on all the different things that are now available, which weren't available, with regard to unstructured data, external data, as well as various, esoteric algorithms and technologies that are all available. The CDO's role is to bridge that first piece, the strategy piece, with these capabilities. So you extract value, and then it's also to execute on delivering that value by making sure that there is an adoption by the organization of what you're creating. And that's the organizational piece of the art, that you've got to kind of master and execute on.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier, I believe in the introduction, this whole idea of organizational change management being really essential to really drive the value opportunity, across the finish line. And so I think that's really a key point to keep teasing out. And as we think about in this conversation, we're thinking about data leaders, CDOs of the future, what they've got to really be trained in and well versed in navigating that whole adoption piece. I think it becomes really, really critical.